Hello everyone, welcome to week 9, and this week we'll talk more about political parties, and I'll do my best to connect this to the discussion of democracy. So basically, let's talk about what we'll cover today. So we'll cover four things. First of all, we'll start with the context. I'll try to give you the historical context of the emergence of political parties and how they evolve and change and adapt and survive. I think that's quite important to talk, especially the future of the political parties. And then we'll talk about functions of the political parties, and then we'll talk about party systems, so the number of political parties in a given system. And finally, we'll talk a little about the future of the political parties that I want to continue to talk more about in tomorrow's discussion. So let's start with the political parties in the US, because this is what we are most familiar with. So basically, I think we can always ask the question, what does explain the survival of political parties such as Democratic Party and Republican Party? They are amazingly enduring institutions. They are with us for almost 200 years now. So of course, when you look at the American politics and history, there are up and downs, and as the Democratic Party, as we know, actually used to be the Republican Party and vice versa, so they change in time over the 20th century. So political parties, what are they, right? They are enduring organizations under whose labels candidates, especially individual politicians, seek and hold elective offices. So this is how we can define political parties. Parties develop and implement rules governing elections. So elections are directly related to political parties. That's the main purpose of the political parties, actually. So that's the main mechanism of them. So they help organize government leadership. So their job is not necessarily getting ready for the elections, but after the elections, especially if they win the elections, they organize the government leadership. And then they have been likened to public utilities. So almost like a service institution, right? Like water companies, like power companies. So because they provide vital services for a democracy. So we can definitely talk more about this in tomorrow's session, but I need to move to the historical context. When you think about the emergence of political parties, I think before political parties, there were fractions within the factions and fractions within the government. So in time, they became political parties only because it makes more sense to get organized under one umbrella organization, so that there are multiple institutions and multiple interests, and the coalition of those interests come together so that they can overcome some of the problems, like collective action problems. So this is number one thing to consider, the emergence of political parties. But then over time, they turn into political machines, especially in the 19th century. So when I say political machines, they became like these monsters that are there only because to win elections, to win seats, so that they can provide some benefits, some interest satisfaction to the people who support them. Especially, I'm talking about the elites, and especially in this one, I'm talking about clientelism, right? These are quite important things to consider when talking about the history of the political parties. In the 20th century, though, parties underwent waves of reform. So that some kind of argue that initiated kind of a period of decline. So we can definitely talk about Schatzsnyder. I'm going to refer him. He's a very important political scientist, and I'm going to read a quote from his very important book, The Semi-Sovereign People. So the flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a strong upper class accent. So he wrote about this in 1960. So you can still apply this quote to explain both of the political parties in the American politics right now. So he was complaining about the convergence of political parties together. So for much of the 20th century, US political parties tended to move to the center, where they figured the most votes were. But starting with Ronald Reagan in 1980, so US politics and parties start to polarize into two increasingly hostile camps, especially considered as even today. So voting in the House and Senate become narrowly partisan with few crossovers and exceptions. So ideology took on a bigger role, eliminating most liberal Republicans and some conservative Democrats. So these are things that we can talk more about tomorrow. But let's move on to the function. So why do we have political parties? Why do we even have them today? How an organization can survive for almost 2 centuries, right? So number one function of any political party is it's kind of a bridge between the people and the government. So it's almost like an inputting device that allow the interests of the citizens to be heard and acted upon the government. So why is this important? It is important because it provides a mechanism for the people to effect policy, of course, on paper. And then it also gives citizens the feeling, this is very important, the belief or the feeling that they have some power, and which definitely increases the efficacy, so that people start to feel like they are important and they have some power to change things in politics. And finally, since because of this feeling of efficacy, it increases and it definitely benefits the legitimacy of government, because it connects citizens to their government, right? So this is number one function of political parties we can refer to. Number two is aggregation of interests. What are we talking about? Interest aggregation. What is it? It is melding separate interests into general party platforms. So especially when we talk about Democratic Party, there are so many diverse interests that are represented in one political party. That's actually why it is more difficult for Democrats to mobilize people, right? So consider, for instance, Bernie Sanders supporters, right? They are so unhappy right now. They do not necessarily want to support Joe Biden, but it is kind of the disadvantage of representing so many different diverse and plural interests. Compared, like the Republicans are not necessarily heterogeneous; they are more homogeneous, right? It is that's why it is more easy for them to convince and mobilize their voters. At least some research shows that. So political parties serve to aggregate those diverse interests in the society into larger interests. So if politics were just interest groups in competition, then it will be a chaos, right? So all these different interests should be actually get organized and aggregated in one political organization. So contemporary parties are effectively loose coalitions. It's very important because you have to be flexible. Otherwise, people might leave your political party or not necessarily mobilize to support your political party. So number three is integration to political system. It's also very important because especially in countries like the US, right? Different social groups are coming into this country, especially I'm talking about immigrants. So political parties serve a very important function, which is integrating all these different groups into the political system so that they not necessarily get violent and radicalized. So new groups integrate into political systems through political parties. You can definitely think about so many different pop culture movies, TV shows, like Italian Americans, how, for example, they got integrated into the system by using political parties and affecting politics. There are so many different things that we can refer, especially tomorrow during our discussion, but it can increase the loyalty of these new groups to the political system so that they not necessarily get radicalized, right? This is very important. It's important, especially not only in the United States, but think about, for example, United Kingdom. So at the very end of the 19th century, in 1899, Labour Party of England got formed. And at first, actually, they were isolated. They were excluded from the political system. They were not allowed to run the elections. But then the political elites of that time, they realized the danger. If they did not let the labor movement get into the political system, they got afraid that they can actually start a revolution. That's why the Labour Party got into the system. And over the years, think about how actually it evolved, right? It has become much more a moderate political party, especially under Tony Blair, for instance, the third way politics. which became almost like a right-centrist political party from a socialist party. So this is quite important. Another important example is Spain, where political parties are quite decentralized, and some political scientists are actually saying that it is harming the whole system, because these political parties, especially in Catalonia, for instance, they not necessarily get integrated into the system, because they have their own political parties for each party family, like socialists, liberals, conservatives, etc. So number 4 is political socialization. It's very important because parties also serve as agents of socialization by helping members, almost like going to school, right, learn to play the political game. So this deepens their sense of trust into the system. It also can serve like a training ground for future leaders. So most of the political leaders, for instance, are getting some important positions in those political parties. Number 5 is mobilization of voters. I think it's extremely important, especially nowadays since we are in the election season. So parties help mobilize citizens to engage with politics, and parties are key players in helping citizens turn out to vote, especially critical in the US, because the turnout rates are very, very low compared to other European countries. So there is also a correlation because of that between the party strength and the voter turnout. Some political scientists argue that political parties are so decentralized in this country so that they are not powerful enough, so that the voter turnout is low. And finally, they organize government. So parties are also agents that organize government, and the winning party has the great deal of latitude in not only setting the government policy, but also in distributing government jobs. So this is also quite important. At the end of the day, political parties are there to win the elections. So I only have 3 minutes, so I will move on very fast. So let's move on to political party systems. So there are one-party systems where you see in totalitarian, authoritarian regimes. It's very easy. There is only one political party system. There is dominant party systems. They are common in neo-authoritarian systems like Turkey's AKP, and then Mexico's PRI. Japan's liberal democracy, Democrats or Liberal Democratic Party is an example. Two-party systems are definitely, you know about them. The US is a two-party system. 2+ party systems like UK, where you have conservatives, Republicans, and Labour Party, Democrats, but also you have Liberal Party. They got into the parliament and sometimes not. And then you have multi-party systems, especially parliamentary systems, where you have the proportional representation, and fluid party systems. Maybe we can talk about those tomorrow. So there is a very important relationship between the electoral system and the party system. So the single most important factor in determining a party system is the electoral system in a country. So single member district systems tend to produce two-party or 2+ party systems like US and the United Kingdom. So only a plurality is needed to win, and small parties cannot necessarily compete, and it encourages parties to avoid fragmentation. So this is only because of the electoral rule. Whereas in proportional representation systems, they use multi-member districts. So this is very important. So it awards seats based on the proportion of the party vote, and then encourages parties to fragment and split as they can still win seats in the parliament. I always give the same example, but the Green Party, right, in the Netherlands and in Germany, for instance, even though they get only 8% of the votes, they can still get seats in the parliament. So it's quite important. So future of political parties, let's talk about those issues tomorrow, but membership in parties are in decline. People are less loyal to their political parties. Most parties have become more mainstream, centrist, and similar, and as a consequence, other actors have assumed some of the major functions of political parties. So I can think about mass media, interest groups, think tanks. So, but at the same time, we can still make the argument that realistically, we can still expect no change to the US two-party system. We can maybe talk about this tomorrow, the future of the political parties in the US, or the biggest question, whether there will be a third party in the United States. So let's talk about these issues tomorrow during our discussion. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll hope to see you all tomorrow. Have a nice day.